Guys, I'm so busy this week with Christmas preparations, and the objects that I'm working on are all super secret because they are Christmas presents, so I can't actually show you anything I've made. But I thought we would sit down and look at the most unpopular knitting opinions and discuss them. So a few days ago I saw someone had made a thread on Reddit saying what's your most unpopular knitting opinion, and I had to read through it, collected the least popular opinions or the most upvoted ones depending on how you see it, and I thought we could discuss them because there were a few really spicy ones in there. The first one was, every pattern doesn't need to have a strand of mohair. Now, I'm sitting here in my little sweater that definitely, as you can see, has some mohair in it, and yet I have to say, I fully agree. I think we have a little bit of a mohair epidemic in knitting pattern design at the moment, and while it looks super nice, I've seen items that I feel like it would just be like super unpractical to have mohair in. I know I've seen at some point on a Ravelry hot page, and I'm quite unsure on like the practicability of this object. I saw a knit underwear tanga string that had mohair in it. I don't know how you clean it properly, but like that was just an absolute no. But yeah, in general, I fully agree with this. Every pattern does not need to have a strand of mohair in it. But on the other hand, I also feel that people are often a bit lazy with substituting yarn. If you do not like mohair in a pattern, I know there's quite a lot of sweaters with mohair in it, and I often like what they look like. And I see people complain in the comments that a sweater design has mohair. You can just substitute it. You can just calculate the yarn weight and substitute with the yarn that doesn't have any mohair. And then you'll have your mohair-free sweater in that same pattern, and you still get to enjoy it. And the mohair-loving part of the knitting community can still have fun with the mohair. So, okay, next one. All that bulky chenille velvet blanket yarn is hideous. I don't care how soft it is, it looks awful, and your finished object will fall apart shortly anyway. You are wasting your time. I think I mostly agree with this actually. I feel like a lot of entry knitters get kind of scammed with like knitting with rovings or with yarn that's really not super suitable. So yeah, I think a lot of the time these projects end up looking really bad after a while and not holding up, and like honestly then it's kind of fast fashion. If you can't wear it, if it's not durable, it's kind of fast fashion. There's not that much of a difference. You're still kind of being wasteful, and I feel like there is a place for some of these yarns as a choice. For example, I've seen really cute crocheted animals that are made from like chenille yarns where it really works. It's not my style, but I fully see why if you like making those you would go for these yarns. But in garment design, yeah, I agree, it's probably not really ever the best choice. This one's funny. If I have to do the entire Colourwork pattern to get the gauge, I might as well just make the project and hope for the best. Give me a segment of the Colourwork or something smaller so it's actually worth my time. Yes, so that's definitely true for me. You know, I don't swatch that much anyway, but if the swatch needs to be huge because you need to swatch like Colourwork and around or something like that, then I don't know, give me a cute little hat to make as my gauge swatch. But if I basically need to like do the knitting twice for it, it just won't happen. If my gauge is completely off on the yoke, then I guess I need to redo the entire thing, but I prefer that risk to like definitely having to do the work twice. I'm usually really bad at calculated risk taking, but this is one that I'm willing to take. I think this one's gonna be a bit controversial. Despite what some people on the sub say, twisted stitches are an error if it was not intended when it was knit. It's not a design feature if you have no idea you're doing it. As someone who used to knit like twisted stitches, I agree, and I'm really happy that I managed to work it out because I saw someone else do it on Reddit and someone said, oh, your stitches are twisted. I was like, oh, actually that looks like mine, when I was re-beginning how to knit. And because twisted stitches can change the characteristics of the fabric, it might give you unintentional like results if you're not doing it on purpose. I still think that most garments where people do that come out fine, and it's okay. It's not really bad or anything like that. But if you're twisting your stitches and you're not doing it on purpose, then as kind of annoying and painful as that is, it's probably better to relearn how to do it so that that doesn't happen, because otherwise you might not like the outcome of whatever project you're doing. This one I don't understand. I hate knitting in the round. I refuse to do it, working flat and seaming pieces all the way. Why? Like, why? I don't know how you get to that. But I find knitting in the round so much easier. I find it's faster. I do not mind purling usually, but like it's just still faster to just knit in the round. And whenever I seam stuff, it just never fully lines up. I guess I'm really bad at that, but I just don't understand why you would mind knitting in the round once you've gotten to the point where you're sure you're not twisting your stitches when you are joining in the round. I feel like that's it, and after that it's a breeze. You just keep going around. You don't have to think about anything. But apparently this user does not agree with that, and I'm really curious like as to why. Relevant to the season, a handmade gift is not inherently better than anything that you've bought in a store. I think that's true. I think like it's really important to keep the person you're gifting gifts to in mind when you're making gifts or when you're buying gifts. And if the person doesn't actually like handmade items, then it doesn't matter how important that item is to you. You shouldn't gift them one. So I'm saying that as someone who does gift knit quite a bit, but I have my people and I know they love my gift knits and they're getting them. And I'm willing to extend that circle a little bit, and I'll just like test the waters a bit by giving someone a smaller item, see how they react, and then I might do something bigger the next time if they're really happy with it. But the first item I give someone that is handmade is always something small, so that I can kind of get a feeling if they like it or not. And it's completely fine if they don't, because not everyone likes knit stuff, and that's fine. Okay, this one I fully agree with, but I think it's quite unpopular. Purling is fine actually, and it gets way more hate than it deserves. I don't know if it's because I knit continental, but I just never found that it bothered me too much to purl. I feel like it can get a little bit boring if you're knitting shawls and then the knit side has interesting textures and interesting stitches, and then you've done that and then you get to the other side and you're just purling, because I feel like it kind of throws me out of my rhythm a little bit sometimes, because I like to either work on projects where I need to concentrate on, or projects I can just do while I'm doing something else. And if I'm concentrating on lace knitting, but then half of the project is actually just purling, then I sometimes find that, oh, okay, yeah, like I wouldn't need to concentrate on these rows that much, but on the front row I do. So I find that kind of a little bit distracting. But apart from that, I don't know why like some of you mind purling that much. Let me know, but like I've never gotten it. Okay, I am actually the target group of this next one 100%, and I still agree with it. If you didn't knit a swatch, you should not complain that the sweater doesn't fit well or that the yarn stretched. You brought it upon yourself. Yeah, I agree, and I've had that happen because I don't swatch a lot of the time, and that's on me. But I always say, like, if you don't swatch, then you don't get to complain if the finished garment doesn't fit, and that's on you. But you don't have to swatch if you don't want to, and I usually don't. Okay, I think the next person is kind of the complete opposite of me knitting wise, and it's quite interesting to see this. So their first point was, I get why people want to knit shawls, but I think they are nearly universally ugly and I will never knit one. I feel like that's, I feel like you're wrong. You just, I think you're wrong. But also, that's because I like to knit shawls, and I've probably made like 20, 25 by now. But yeah, I feel like shawls are awesome. Shawls are beautiful. I found many ways in which to wear them with stuff to different occasions and things, but I've heard this quite a lot in the knitting community, and I know a lot of you think it looks a little bit grammar style, but I love my shawls, and I will defend them against this. Their second point was, I think having a giant yarn stash is wasteful. I'm talking about the kind where there's no way it can all be used before the owner dies. Yeah, I think people call that sable, right? Stash acquisition beyond life expectancy, I think. I agree with this. This is wasteful and this is a waste of resources. But I can see how it would happen, because I think lots of people really like to collect yarn for the possibilities that each item of wool you buy brings. Like, I know that's what it is often for me. I feel like I have a relatively big stash. I think it's small-ish compared to what other people have, and I could definitely knit this up within my lifetime. But I can see how if you've been knitting for like 30 years, you might have a stash that you know you're never gonna get through while you're alive. And yeah, it is a waste of resources, but so are a lot of other things that we're not so judgy about. And I feel like a lot of it is because this is a very gendered hobby, and we like to criticize women for collecting things that are very specifically gendered towards women. This is like also true for people who have lots of makeup and things like that. And I'm someone who likes to have options. So like, for example, I also said in the recent video, I have quite a lot of inks, I have quite a lot of different eyeshadows and stuff like that. Nothing excessive. And I feel like this person definitely has a point when it comes to the point where it produces a lot of clutter. I've seen some YouTubers on here whose yarn stash gives me kind of like heart palpitations, where I'm like, oh my god, how do you live in this chaos? Where like I've seen people have like trash bags stuffed full of yarn, and then the yarn stuffed under beds or something like that, and that just really stresses me out to even think about. But if we're just talking about it in the sense of, yeah, you definitely have quite a bit too much yarn, but it's tidy, and you're looking strictly at this is a waste of resources, yes, so is food waste, so is like driving somewhere when you could walk, so is flying on vacation, so is like going through clothes without repairing them, which I think a lot of us knitters do. We do actually repair items instead of throwing them out. So is buying new shoes where you don't need them, watches, cars, like changing your car more frequently, stuff like that. And I feel like all of these things individually are things we don't criticize people as much about, but because knitting is a hobby that attracts people who like to live quite sustainably, myself included, we are quite harsh on ourselves and on the community members to not accrue a surplus because it's wasteful. But yeah, I feel like sometimes it's a bit much. Third point, I can't stand having more than one work in progress at a time. I cast on a project and knit until I finish it before casting on the next. Yeah, I'm a multitasker, I don't get this at all. I like to have different projects and being able to pick one up when I feel like it and then another one when I feel like that. I have different moods that I have different projects for, and I interchange them when I feel like it. And I think this person's really not like me at all. Also proven by the next point, I think fair eye yoke sweaters are ugly AF. I disagree. Like, I think they're so pretty, I think they're so beautiful. It's really hard to find any of these kind of sweaters in store somewhere. I like how colorful they are and how cozy they look, and then I'm not an elegant knitter anyway. I like cozy cottage core knit stuff, and I feel like that's quite its own thing. So I can see how you just generally don't like fair yoke sweaters. And then they go on with their fifth point, which is I also like double pointed needles. I kind of hate double pointed needles. I will use them if I have to, but I even got those like 20 centimeter long round needles to knit like the ribbing on sleeves and mittens and stuff like that, so I could avoid doing double pointed needles whenever possible. I'm just not concentrated enough for them. I end up pulling out the wrong needle all the time, and I find it difficult to store them in a way that they don't fly out of the project, but that's just me. And this is my completely anti-person apparently on Reddit, and I wonder how we would get along in person. Probably really well, but like agree to disagree. And it's good that people have different kind of taste, right? Otherwise it would get quite boring. Okay, the next one is also going to be really controversial, and it's kind of joining on the last person's comment. People afford what they can afford. Don't punch down on them for their fiber choices. I think I mostly agree with this. I feel like it's kind of what I said with the sustainability aspect, that we tend to be a bit too strict on our community. But for me, that's more on the side of, I understand why people would collect too much yarn, but I'm a little bit less understanding when people keep churning out like acrylic blankets again and again and again and again. Like, I'm not talking about people who knit with acrylic yarn because it's the most useful for a specific purpose and they've thought about it and they made that choice consciously. But I feel like there are some people who churn out stuff in a way that's almost like fast fashion, with really bulky acrylic yarns, and there I do feel like I'm a little bit judgy sometimes, because it's microplastic. You're producing microplastic. You say you buy it because it's easy to wash and you throw it in a washing machine, but that produces a lot of microplastic because that's what acrylic is, it's plastic. And I think that punching down on people because of their like fiber choices in general, because you can't afford, like, I don't know, yak or merino or something like that, is completely wrong. But I do feel like there are often, and there's like often kind of like a denial that there are options that are also really cheap that are not acrylic, and people tend to go for acrylic instead, and options that would be as well suited for a specific project. And that I do not understand, because as you know, I always kind of like talk about how much the wool for specific projects cost for me, because I used to be on a really tight budget, and that's why it's really important for me to talk about the cost of yarn. And you've seen me crank out sweaters that were less than 15 euros, or like I think $17 in yarn. And I feel like that's also then kind of, if you knit a sweater, you're working on it 30-40 hours, so you've spent like, I don't know, 30 cents or something for each hour you're working on it for your hobby, and that's completely fine and that's really cheap. And I feel like then you don't have to make 10 acrylic blankets in the same time. I mean, there's some people who do it for really specific purposes, like maybe some of you will comment and be like, oh, I make acrylic blankets specifically because I donate them for homeless people in the homeless shelter in my town. Fine. There's people who are like, oh, I have a grandchild and he throws up a lot because he's a baby, and so I make baby blanket for him from acrylic yarn so the parents can just wash it really quickly. Completely fine. But if you're just kind of like mindlessly using acrylics without thinking about if there's an alternative, then I will judge you a tiny little bit. And that's not saying that I'm at all perfect with my crafting habits, because I know very much that I'm not, but I feel like sometimes there are ways in which we could be more sustainable without impacting our finances and without impacting our project quality, and then I think it's really worth it. Okay, this used to be me in the beginning of my knitting to an extent, and I'm not like that anymore. I'm not knitting something that can't go in the washing machine. So I feel like that applies to a lot of people who use a lot of acrylics, like we just talked about, but also to people who only use superwash yarns, and that used to be me, because I used to only knit with superwash wool. And I talked in my last video about how I'm kind of falling out of love a bit with Malabrigo Rios, and I've just learned over time that microplastics, like superwash, always the microplastics, but no, like with superwash yarn, a lot of them are kind of coated in plastic as well, and it makes me sweat. I mean, it's less plastic because it's not the entire yarn, but it's still not great. And also the process is not really good for the environment. And I realized I really like the characteristics that a lot of fabrics have if they're made in non-superwash yarn, if they're made in real wool. So But on the other hand, I also agree that like hand washing items can be a pain in the ass, especially if it's a sweater. It's just really annoying. But right now I'm more and more willing as time goes on to accept this. I will still knit with superwash yarn because also I still have quite a bit in my stash that I want to use up because it would be wasteful not to. But over time I think I will be shifting more towards non-superwash wool more and more because I'm learning to really love the fabric characteristics and the grippiness of wool that hasn't been treated like that. I feel like this is one of the truest things to come out of this thread. Your first knitting project should be a hat knit in the round. Scarves are the worst first project. Yes, agree, fully, you're right. When I've taught people to knit, I taught them to knit a hat as well. I feel like it's a bit more difficult because you have to teach them decreases at the top. Excuse me. It's been a week. It's been so busy. I'm so busy with Christmas stuff. I'm like, oh my god. But yeah, not with the knitting that much, but like with just the logistics of Christmas, having a huge family and the family having birthdays in the same month and all. Oh my god, but like, no. Back to the topic at hand. It's a bit more difficult because you have to teach people to decrease as well and to kind of weave in the top of the hat and like pull it in together and stuff. But I feel like that's really worth it because A, they don't have the skill, and B, it's a much smaller project than a scarf. I feel like a scarf is a demotivating beginner project because if you teach them a garter stitch scarf, which is not gonna roll, which is better, they don't even know purl stitches from it. They just know how to knit. And like most people will get that after a few rows, but then they're like this way through the scarf and they still have to knit so much more to get a usable item out of what you're teaching them. And I feel like it's the worst way to teach someone how to knit. Let me know if you disagree with that, but I feel like a lot of us learned knitting by knitting scarves, and I feel like it's much better to teach someone how to knit a hat in relatively bulky yarn. They have a hat after a few hours of knitting. You can teach them knit and purl stitches because you teach them the ribbing, you teach them to decrease, you teach them to like pull together the top of the hat, to cast on everything. Like a hat is just a great first project, and a scarf is this takes forever, and oh my god, if you torture yourself through this whole thing, then you really do love this hobby. And these two are quite similar. Most hand painted and dyed skeins look better as skeins than as knitted objects, and variegated yarn is ugly. So I will say that I know where these people are coming from, because I've seen yarn in a skein where I was completely blown away, and then I saw what it would look like knit up because I looked on Ravelry and it was really underwhelming. I feel like it's also a skill to select projects that work with variegated yarn or sprinkled yarn or whatever hand-dyed yarn you're working with. I definitely at some point picked a yarn that was a bit too variegated to make a lace shawl, and it threw off the lace pattern completely because it was kind of invisible, and I see why some people then call it clown bath and where they're coming from. But I feel like variegated yarn, especially in other fiber crafts, has a really good place and can look really beautifully. I think looking at it crocheted, sometimes it looks nicer than knitted, and I think looking at it woven, it looks really nice as well. I feel like with knitting, it's often the most beautiful when the project is really simple, like a stockinette stitch something, and I think it's really hard to make it work with specific things like with lace work. But overall, I would say I disagree with this, because I mean, my mountain of variegated yarn up there is looking at me sadly, and I love it. I just learned to pick yarn that is not quite as variegated as I would maybe go for if it would look exactly the same way knit up as it would in the skein. I hope you liked this little bit of a different kind of video. I had a lot of fun with this, and let me know what your most unpopular knitting opinion is below in the comments. Also, if you like this video, please do not forget to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel. I see a lot of people are coming back to watch them, but not everyone's subscribed, and that's perfectly fine. But if you don't want to, but I feel like lots of us, because we're busy and things, we tend to kind of forget, and it is really helpful for this channel. So I hope you have a really nice pre-Christmas season. I see you next week, where I can actually probably show you a finished object for once again, which is very exciting. And yeah, have a great week. Bye bye.